Today we're going to be talking about teaching our kids how to think like historians. It's part of our Literacy by Fifth Grade initiative, which is something that's relatively new here at our COE. Our new superintendent, Dr. Edwin Gomez, launched this initiative and wanted to get our improve literacy by fifth grade. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and what we're going to be doing here in the field of history, social science for us. We're going to move right into phase one, which is our literacy definition. So like, what are we even talking about? You know, why, where does this come from and what's going on? So I mentioned that we have this, this literacy by fifth grade initiative that Dr. Edwin Gomez, our COE superintendent, put out. And one of the things we wanted to do is we made sure that we defined what we meant by literacy. And so the definition that we've come up with is literacy is the ability to read, write, listen, speak, research, and represent in order to think critically, create, collaborate, and communicate with empathy or compassion in all content areas. So it's a pretty robust thing that we're talking about doing here. It's not just your basic reading and writing. We're talking about going deep with that within those disciplines of science, history, English, language arts, and we're talking about being able to do that with empathy. And we're also talking about a lot of different things.
In having a conversation, that's how we define literacy in our Lit by 5 initiative. The ELA Framework has a different conversation around literacy, and they use the ELA or the ELD turtle. That's what I like to call it. It's this beautiful turtle that's inside the ELA ELD Framework, and you can see what all of the different things that encompass what literacy is for ELA. And off on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got the instructional framework for the history, social sciences. And I think this is coming out right out of chapter 21 when we're talking about instructional strategies. But here we're talking, in history, we talk about analyzing source relevance. We're talking about chronology and context. We want our students to ask questions. We want our students to look for motives as to why something was written or when it was written, whom it was written for, and that we look at a document and keep in mind the circumstances and the time that it was created. We want to note corroborations. We want to see discrepancies. You know, it's literally like a history. Every time we look at a document, it's a history investigation. Or it's like when you step outside of your classroom for a minute and then you walk back inside and all of a sudden things are not the way that they were when you walked outside of your classroom. And then you ask what happened and you get 12 different answers, you know? Not unlike when my kids are fighting and all of a sudden I'm like, what's going on? And all of a sudden nothing, you know, everything's fine, right? So that's what's going on there. But you'll notice that there's a ton of crossover between what's going on, between what history is asking for and what English is asking for. So we're talking about readiness for college and career and civic life. We're talking about being broadly literate. We're also talking about content knowledge, meaning making, which is really what it's all about within the history of social science. How does that work and how does that develop? And at the core of that is reading, writing, speaking, and listening within all of those disciplines. So you can kind of see the connections to what it is that we're doing. And so if you've been working with doing history, social science in your elementary class, you're already doing some of that, so which is fantastic. All right. So now we're going to dive into some serious resources here. We're going to take a look at some history, social science, literacy tools that we can use for our evaluation purposes. Before I jump into that, I just want to quickly remind everybody what primary sources are, secondary sources are, and what I'm going to affectionately call primary source inception. So primary source is something that was written at the time it was written, or at the time of the event. So if we're doing if we're looking at the Boston Tea Party, for example, a journal written about the Boston Tea Party, the newspaper article the next day about the Boston Tea Party, or you know, some political cartoons and things like that. Those are all primary sources. They were written at the time that it was created, right? So in the 1800s, let's say right after the Civil War, we're gonna see people writing about the Boston Tea Party and the events that took place. That would be considered a secondary source because that source is written after the fact, way after the event took place. It relies upon primary sources for information, but it really is going to provide some context and texture that you don't necessarily get from looking at a primary source. And so secondary sources are just different. They're not bad, they're not worse, they're just different. Now, so that primary source is written in this, or that secondary source we just mentioned is written in the Civil War. If I am an educator today and I want to look at the attitudes of people
who were studying or the attitudes of people during the Civil War about the American Revolution and things that we thought about the American Revolution, I could be looking at that book that was written as a secondary source, right? And if I am, that secondary source has now become a primary source. And welcome to primary source inception. Does that make sense? Where your secondary source has now become a primary source because we're evaluating that secondary source as a reflection of the attitudes and values about the people in that particular time period. So all of that to kind of give us some time to take a look at some history, social science, literacy tools for evaluation purposes. So some tools that we can use in our classroom to evaluate primary and secondary sources. Great tools that were actually developed by the Colorado Department of Education that we begged, borrowed, and stole from, and then made some minor changes to. And so we're grateful to our friends for developing those resources. We've made some minor tweaks to them and given you those to take a look at. You're getting, those resources are being made available to you in Word so that you can take them and modify them to your own curriculum, and they're also being given to you in PDF. I wanted to use a piece of curriculum that's not inside of Benchmark or Wonders and offer opportunity for you guys to do that. And so in keeping with kind of our local history, I went with Sylvia Mendez. And I don't like to read to people a whole lot, but in this particular instance, I am going to read this one time as we kind of go through this. This particular article is a second source that comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica. We pulled that down off of that. And then what you'll see off to the left-hand side is a book called Separate is Never Equal, a marvelous children's story that talks about the Sylvia Mendez story. There is a teaching resource guide on, if you have that book, we've put that link in the chat. There's also a ton of read alouds of that book on YouTube. And then I dropped in my favorite. It's so you can have access to that so that you can give your students access to that if you're interested. And I think Grace is also dropping in the Amazon link if you want to purchase the book. I think it's like 15 bucks on Amazon for the hardcover. Sylvia Mendez off of Britannica for Kids. In 1944, Sylvia Mendez, Mexican-American family, had recently moved. She and her siblings were not allowed to go to public school close to the farm and were instead told they had to attend the Mexican school, which was further away and fewer resources. Sylvia's father found other families willing to join him, suing the school district, whose only reason had been, "That is how it is done." During the trial, Sylvia and her family listened to terrible statements in which school district officials blatantly claimed that Mexican children were not as smart as white children. The Mendez family won their case in 1946. The judge said it was wrong to separate Hispanic students because of race. Another judge agreed and made all schools stop separating students in all California public schools. This ruling helped win the Board of Education versus Topeka, Kansas case, that stopped all public schools in the United States from separating students because of their race. We'll take a look at this article now. And then so I would hand this out to my students. So they're looking at their primary source analysis sheet. And then we look at are there any special markings on the document question? I would X that out and I would tell our kids we're not even going to worry about that because what we're dealing with here is a secondary source. And so we won't see any of those. What we see is be looking at something a little bit different. So we're not even going to worry about that. But then we come down here and is the document handwritten, typed, or printed? And then we know that this document is typed. And then because it came and because it's very nice and very easy to read, right? And so then we kind of move in and then what is the date of the document? And so your kids may pick up on that there was some dates in there, 1944 and 1946, and they may be savvy enough, depending on how much work you've done with them, to notice that it says that this article was written in 2015 from the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we know that this is a relatively new article, that it came out in 2015. It's about 6 years old. Well, I don't know how new. It's new to us. I mean, that's not very new to kids because, now all of a sudden, it's like half their life ago, right? I'm going to tackle these next two questions. Who wrote the document? Who received the document? And I put an X through how is this document important to our history, because we're going to come back to that. To me, it's the most important question that we're going to talk about today. And so I want to tackle the easier questions, and who wrote the document and who received the document. When we take a look at this, we know that it's on Britannica for Kids, and there's this copyright. So somebody from the Cooperative Children's Book Center wrote this, but who did they write it for? And who is getting this information, and where is it? And so we might show our students that this is online, that it's on the Britannica for Kids website. And so that it was really written for kids our age, and for us to have an understanding about what's going on, you know? And I think that that's a really important distinction, that we understand that, like, even if it's a secondary source, there is a target audience for it. And even if we've got this source right here, and there's an audience for us, and it's an audience for our students. And so some things are written for us, so that way we can understand that. And so then we come into, are there any words that you don't know? And then what I've taken the liberty of doing, or what Princess took the liberty of doing, is highlighting words that might be a little strenuous for our third graders to just necessarily understand, and get into a conversation about what school they go to. Is there a school that's closer? What school their brother goes to? Is that school farther away? You know, and what are resources, and what do those mean? You know, I'm a big MCU guy, and so we had a huge conversation with I might get some parenting maelstrom from this, but I took my kid to see Infinity War, and he was our Endgame, and he didn't understand why Thanos was trying to get rid of half the people in the universe. And so we had a resource conversation where I ate a piece of chocolate, and I was like, there's only enough chocolate for me. There's not enough for you. And he very much understood why resources were important and what they were at that particular point in time. Anytime our kids have to share, anytime they're at their groups, that's resources, and how we pull them together to share or get them away. Suing gets to be a bit complicated, but you know, when it's very simple. When you've got a disagreement about whose time it is to use whatever toy it is, you take that either to your parents or to your teacher, and they make those decisions like, yeah, okay, it's Johnny's turn, or it's Susie's turn, or actually it's none of your turns, you know, and that can happen. And so when adults can't make those determinations, they go to a judge, and those judges kind of make those determinations as to whether or not Sylvia Mendez should be going to the Mexican school, or if she can go to the other school. And so some rich opportunities there for conversations with our kids, so that they can develop those tools and those resources. So then we get into what the main idea or the topic of the document. This gets to be exciting because, you know, you're going to be soliciting feedback from your kids. You're going to be trying to lead them to water in this particular instance. And what I'm hoping our students understand from this document is that Sylvia Mendez wasn't able to go to school that she wanted to go to initially, but then a judge said that it wasn't fair, and that she was able to then go to school. And then that sets up it so that everybody in California can go to the same school. And then eventually everybody in the United States could go to school not based on race. And then we talk about pulling two quotes that support the main idea and the evidence. And with that thought in mind, what I'm hoping my students pull in particular this document are maybe like the second sentence. She and her siblings were not allowed to go to the public school close to their farm, and were instead told they had to go to the Mexican school, which was farther away and had fewer resources. And then maybe the judge said it was wrong to Hispanic students because of, it was wrong to separate Hispanic students because of race. What's important about this is it doesn't have to be my two thoughts, you know. And when I talk to my 6-year-old about things and I ask him what his thinking is, oftentimes I'm amazed at what he comes up with, just because I would have never thought of that. And I don't have the perspective of a 6-year-old, you know, I'm an old man. And so when I hear that thinking, I'm like, oh, that actually does make sense. I didn't really think of it that way. And so when our students give us answers or quotes or sentences that we necessarily didn't ascribe as one of those 2 main quotes, let's ask them why, and let's get into some rich conversations with their students around that, you know, while they're willing to share. And then as long as that supports whatever that idea is, it's fine. It's a great example. And so then we come back to this last question. Now that they have a better understanding of what this document is and what this document is about, we talk about how is this document important to our history? You know, we're not talking about the Sylvia Mendez case. We're talking about this article right here. How is it important to our history? And I think that this document is important to our history because now my 3rd graders understand the importance of Brown versus the Board of Education and the importance of Sylvia Mendez's case, Mendez v. Westminster. And now my 3rd graders can engage in an amazing conversation about the importance, the need to not segregate, or the importance of what's going on in their own communities. Because, you know, Orange County is just a hop, skip, and a jump, as a quick freeway ride away from a lot of them. Really just right down the road that we've got this rich history that's taking place and really kind of changing what happens in America. And so this is a huge deal because now my 3rd graders can engage with this. And I think that that's why this document is important. This is something that I would probably be giving to our students early on. And the first several times I do this, we're gonna model, I'm gonna do a lot of the work. We're gonna do a lot of I do, and then we do, and eventually phases of gradual release where they're able to do some of it on their own. But the goal is to really just getting them to start diving in and looking at these things and looking at them critically, teaching them that critical thought process. What questions do they have about the document? I mean, we've talked about this to death. We've done a lot of different things. We've covered a lot of different things. They might want to know what happened with the Board of Education versus Topeka case. You know, they might want to know why Sylvia Mendez's Mexican family moved. And those are great questions to ask. And the cool thing is there's some rich history in Sylvia Mendez's family moving. Sylvia Mendez's family was actually able to afford a house in Westminster because it was occupied by a Japanese person prior to Executive Order 9044. And then that was the only reason why that house was affordable in that neighborhood for them. And so there's some rich history there that we could get into, some rich history with the Brown versus the Board of Education. There's a lot of different ways that we can go, and they may not have any questions, and that's okay, you know, but there's definitely some jumping off points to some other rich resources.